Art is many things these days, but a reflection of actual reality. In a newspaper dated March 27, 2020, a professor named Sheriff Abayomi was being interviewed by Art Parade. In his exact words, art is life and life is art, and the two cannot be separated. And also, in an interview on the 2nd of March 2001, the Art Parade was also conducting an interview. And in that interview by Basso Getaria, he says, and I quote, that every piece of art should reflect a dominant institution and a prevalent idea, that art is a tool of correction, that my work should describe or better still prescribe, and that in so doing it should advance man. The Britannica Dictionary defines art as something that is created with imagination and skill, that is beautiful, or that expresses important feelings or ideas. Other definitions of art describe art as subjects of study primarily concerned with human creativity and social life, such as languages, literature, and history, as contrasted with scientific or technical subjects. As we all know, since the beginning of time, art has enjoyed such high accord. Or has it? In this video, I'll attempt to walk you through the history of art in Nigeria and basically where art fell off. I'll present my argument on the reasons why art no longer reflects reality. But for me to do that, my literary persona has advised that we circle back to the 80s, popularly referred to as the classical era. Back in the days of Plato, and with his publication of his treatise, The Republic is probably Plato's most famous dialogue, and it basically talks of two of Plato's most popular theories, which is the theory of forms and his ideal mode of government. It's important for me to state here that mimesis is a term that was discussed by Plato and also Aristotle. Basically, in the history of literature, mimesis has been used to describe so many things, referring to as imitation, but imitation in the sense of representation and not just copying. It's generally agreed that mimesis is a representation of actual reality and that literature mimics reality. However, it is Plato's view that mimesis in art, and by art here it is inclusive of literature and also other forms of art. And actually, according to Plato, it is his idea that the term mimesis or the practice of mimesis actually is negative, in the sense that it only serves to confound our abilities to see reality. So in my previous video, I made reference to the fact that Plato believes that art, which is in literature, is thrice removed from the truth. Plato is most preoccupied with the search for metaphysical truth. So according to Plato, art itself just confounds our ability and does not allow us to see the real truth. So studying this concept or studying this idea that Plato propagates, it just makes me wonder, is representation of reality a bad thing in itself? Plato goes on to say that because poets actually tell a lie, because poets are liars, and because what they represent is not actual truth, they should be banned from the Republic, amongst other reasons. With Plato's stance on art, it begs the question, how did art rise to being accorded so much relevance in today's world, when just like Christian martyrs, artists, poets were marginalized in the days before? My submission, however, is that the amount of respect accorded to poets from time immemorial to date has fluctuated depending largely on political events, cultural events, and also social events that were taking place at the time. In some societies, writers have been highly regarded, and in some societies, they have been marginalized or even persecuted. To better drive this point home, it becomes important for us to, go back again and actually look at the history of poets and artists. So I'm just going to start from the points where it's generally regarded to be the beginnings of art, which is ancient civilization Egypt. In ancient civilizations like Egypt, Mesopotamia, and China, scribes and writers held important roles, especially because literature was a specialized skill. So scribes in Egypt, for instance, were highly valued and highly recognized because they were responsible for producing sacred religious texts. In ancient China, scholars and writers associated with Confucianism were respected for their intellectual and moral guidance. Moving over to ancient Greece and Rome, in ancient Greece, poets like Homer were held in high esteem, as poetry and storytelling were seen as essential to the development of young minds. Philosophers like Plato and Aristotle obviously were also highly regarded. However, not all writers were equally valued at this time. In Rome, writers like Virgil and Horace were celebrated, particularly for their patriotic works. At this time, it is also important to mention that writers were often dependent on patronage or sponsorship from churches to produce their works. So it basically means that their social acceptance and social status were heavily tied to their securement of social approval. Then in the medieval period, which is also referred to as the Middle Ages, especially in Europe, writers were often clerics or monks who worked in monasteries, and they were copying religious texts or producing theological writings. Even though these writers often had significant religious importance, they were often anonymous, and secular writers had very little influence unless they were attached to a royal body. Then also we move on to the era of Renaissance and Enlightenment. The Renaissance marked a turning point in Europe when humanist writers like Dante, Petrarch, and Shakespeare became central figures in cultural life. Writers and scholars were once again valued for their contribution. However, even in this period, writers often faced censorship or persecution if their writings were against the accepted social norm. During this enlightened period, writers such as Voltaire and others were highly regarded because of the fact that they were able to shape public discourse, and also because they were able to influence political change. Still, many writers even at this time faced imprisonment or exile for their controversial ideas, which again goes back to my point to the fact that writers were marginalized based on how heavy their works were. Now, in the modern era, writers have gained varying levels of prestige. 19th and early 20th centuries, writers like Charles Dickens, Leo Tolstoy, Mark Twain became cultural thinkers, cultural writers, and they were widely admired for their social critique, their contribution to public discourse, shaping political movements and political events at the time. However, writers critical of government or social norms, such as those in authoritarian regimes, have often faced persecution or exile. One person that comes to mind is Ngugi wa Thiong'o with his production of his play, I Will Marry When I Want. After this play, he had to go into exile because he was being heavily persecuted. Another poet that comes to mind also is Dennis Brutus, who wrote heavily. He was actually a South African activist, and he wrote very heavily about the apartheid regime. Let's just dwell a bit on Ngugi wa Thiong'o and contribution to art, his contribution to public discourse. Now, if you don't know, he originates from Kenya. His reason for persecution is the post-colonial critic. Ngugi wa Thiong'o is a Kenyan writer and an academic, and he's known for his sharp critiques of colonialism and neocolonialism. His play, which criticized the Kenyan government and its treatment of the poor, led to his arrest in 1977. He was actually detained for a year without trial and was subjected to government censorship. Eventually, he had to go into exile after multiple threats on his life. So, impact on writing. In my previous video also, I've made reference to the language question, but in this specific instance, Ngugi made a political decision to write in his native language, which is Gikuyu. This was a conscious decision on his part because he wanted to use the language, he wanted to use his native language as a tool of resistance for colonialism. His book, Decolonizing the Mind, has now become a pillar of post-colonial studies. Now, moving on to the scene of music. Remember that I said that this is cascading between music and literature. One activist that comes to mind is Fela. Fela is a famous musician and also political activist. AllMusic described him as a musical and socio-political voice of international significance. Fela Kuti was highly engaged in political activism in Africa from the 1970s until his death.
Everybody say yeah.
He criticized the corrupt era that pervaded Nigeria specifically, and he spoke of colonialism as the root of socio-economic and political problems that bedeviled Nigeria at the time. However, Kuti's open vocalization of his thoughts were not without consequence. He was arrested on over 200 different occasions and spent time in jail, including his longest stint of 20 months after his arrest in 1984. Also, speaking about music, one person that is regarded as a contemporary musician would be Idris Abdul Karim. He released his music, Nigerian Jaga Jaga, and as we all know, got into trouble for it. He can be called a microphone activist because he was also speaking and advocating on the political regime and the political atmosphere that pervaded Nigeria. One thing that stands out is the fact that he continues to make conscious effort in his music. Well, maybe not continuous, but he was at the time making conscious effort to at least comment on the reality of the average Nigerian. Having emerged from one of Nigerian's pioneer hip-hop group, the Remedies, Idris cut his teeth in social conscious music. in 2003, which is release of the song titled Mr. Lecturer, which he exposed the issue of sex for grades, which again is an issue that has pervaded the Nigerian academic system. Okay, you might be asking, what is your point? Circling back to my submission that the status of writers in history has greatly fluctuated, depending largely on the cultural, social, and political period at the time. I've submitted that in some societies, some writers were marginalized, and in other societies, writers were highly respected. In contemporary literature, it is generally agreed that literature is a mirror of society. One difference that I love to cite is the difference between history and literature. I mean, when you want to look at the history of a place, there are several books, written on history, written on, dates and events and occurrences. What makes literature different from history is the fact that only literature can accurately convey the psychological and sociological stance of the period in question. Now, for instance, if I were reading the book Half of a Yellow Sun, let's say 10 years down the line, and I want to know about the Civil War, I mean, it's easy for me to just go and, read about Civil War. But for me to actually guess the sociological stance of the people that were affected, I would have to turn to literature. So for instance, in the case of Half of a Yellow Sun, if I want to see how people were getting married, how lovers were coping in that period, the book would provide me with accurate representation of that period. And that's one thing that I think is a distinguishing factor between history and literature. So now, because literature is giving me, an accurate representation of the social stance, it then means that literature must then reflect reality. Now, in the 1960s, much of the work produced largely contributed the body of work, which we now refer to as post-colonial text. This is so because this text right back to the center, example, Things Fall Apart, Arrow of God, and on the wider scale, we have Ferdinand Oyono, who wrote his book titled The Houseboy. Ultimately, post-colonial Nigerian authors sought to change the way in which Nigerians saw themselves so that they could envisage themselves as an empowered people whose cultural knowledge is a pragmatic combination of indigenous and British beliefs and values. Now, moving to the emergence of war literature. So if you haven't caught the drift, Nigerian literature basically progressed from post-colonial critic, writing about the life of the average Nigerian or the life of the average African with all his sensibilities. We then moved on to the development of, war literature, basically, which is again writing about the Civil War. The movement of the Nigerian war literature produced writers such as Christopher Okibo, J.P. Clark, Chukwuemeka K. Elichi Amadi, amongst others. Christopher Okibo is a favorite of mine who wrote his poems between 1965 and 1966. One thing that is really striking about him is the fact that he so deeply warned about, the emergence of the war. He warned about the inevitability of the collapse of a system that has lost morals. This is exemplified in his poems like Hooray for Thunder and Come for Thunder. I'm going to read some lines for Hooray of Thunder. The elephant, tetrarch of the jungle, with a wave of the hand, he could pull 4 trees to the ground. His 4 mortal legs pounded the earth wherever they treaded. The grass was forbidden to be there. Alas, the elephant has fallen. Hooray for thunder. But already the hunters are talking about pumpkins. If they share the meat, let them remember thunder. Also, in Come for Thunder, he uses lines like, the arrows of God tremble at the gates of light, the drums of curfew pander to a dance of death, and the secret thing in its heaving threatens with iron mask, the last lighted torch of the century. The Nigerian war literature has, again, emerged many writers like Chimamanda and Ngozi Adichie who have contributed to the topic. We also have a latest release titled The Road to the Country by Chigozie Obioma. And also a famous one is There Was a Country by Chinua Achebe. The point I'm making here is that all these different political atmospheres have provided literature which accurately reflects the times. So then, I guess this is my major question. What really is happening today? Where is the body of literature that is accurately representing the life of the average Nigerian? After the Civil War and to the present, the country has been thrown into so much poverty. In 17 November 2022, The National Bureau of Statistics made a press release in which it stated that the federal government, through the National Bureau of Statistics, has launched the results of the 2022 Multidimensional Poverty Index, MPI, and highlights of the 2022 Multidimensional Poverty Index survey reveal that 63% of persons living in Nigeria, which make up 133 million people, are multidimensionally poor. The national MPI is 0.257, indicating that poor people in Nigeria experience just over 1/4 of all possible deprivations. Over half of the population in Nigeria are multidimensionally poor and cook with dung, wood, or charcoal rather than cleaner energy. High deprivations are also apparent nationally in sanitation, access to health care, food insecurity, and housing. The Nigerian Biafra War was fought in between the years of 1967 to 1970. From 1970 down to January 2020, global data reveals that an estimated 95 million Nigerians are living in extreme poverty. Nigeria was first dubbed the poverty capital of the world in 2018 by World Poverty Clock, which tracks real-time estimates globally. Since that time, an extra 8 million Nigerians have slid into extreme poverty. Again, here is my question. From that time till date, where is the literature reflecting this? Where's the music? Where's the art? Let's dwell on the musical scene for a while. According to this article I found online, it posits that the socio-political consciousness of hip-hop seemed to have been on the decline, while its activist role has been watered down to a near opposite pattern of narratives, which celebrates mundanities and visualizes eroticism and misogyny, amongst other illicit vices. This has generated a lot of criticism and debate as to why the present rap culture have chosen the path of commercialism and jettisoned social commentary, and perhaps this is not far-fetched, as rappers always easily bow to the pressure of the elites that own the music industry to sell out for a guaranteed commercial success. Quoting Witsa and Kubrin, they said that rap artists are influenced by pressures from elites in the music industry. To maximize sales, record industry moguls encourage provocative, edgy lyrics. Producers not only encourage artists to become hardcore, but also reject or marginalize artists who go against the grain. As a result of such practices, a directly proportional relationship has developed between rap music's explicitness and the sale of its records. Citing Wale Adedeji, the major themes found in Nigerian contemporary hip-hop music can be summarized into some categories. The first one being dance and party raps, the second being love and relationships, the third being bragging rights or ego tripping, the fourth being glamour and materialism, the fifth being girls and sexuality. To further illustrate this point, I'm going to cite my example from the music titled Yahuze, which was released in 2007 by Olumide. In recent times also, an artist that has captured the area of sexualism and eroticism vividly is Rema, with his song titled Soundgasm, released in 2021. Also, Shay Vibes, Bullion Balm is basically talking about glamour, materialism, gangsterism, street life, talk life, and what have you. Also, another song that comes to mind is the song titled Dila by Ayomath and Fireboy. I know that in 2020, Idris released the song titled Country Hard. I do appreciate the fact that this song was able to at least capture the reality of the average Nigerian. And I also know that in terms of movie, the movie was released by Netflix titled Citation, which is a film about a university student named Morame who has to deal with sexual abuse from her lecturer. And the movie is basically a reaction to university culture and again the issue of sex for grades that was and is prevalent in Nigerian universities. So I do know that there is actually literature, there's actually music, there's actually, plays that are written about the life of the average Nigerian and its attendant hardships. But I feel like there's just a sprinkle of this. I feel like the major things that we're hearing about is gossip. We're either listening to celebrity gossip or we're talking about other things that don't even matter. I feel like basically there has been this romanticization of reality. There isn't a lot of art that goes against the grain to basically capture the reality as we have it today. I've sat with this question for a while and I've pondered it, and I also came across a journal entry that was written in 1975 where the question of why no more literature has been published after the Civil War. And in this journal entry, the reason offered is that yet another factor is probably more significant. Nigerians have understandably been more absorbed in rebuilding their country than in pondering the past. Life is more immediately demanding than history, and though one must learn from the past to safeguard the future, it may nonetheless be wise to avoid inflammation while healing the wounds of fratricidal struggle. Again, this is just illustrating my point that are we as Nigerians still, living nostalgic life where we're still just like hinged up in the past and nobody is just thinking to reflect what exactly is happening. I mean, people are complaining life and center life is barely worth living these days, and somehow it just feels like all the time we're bombarded by music, we're bombarded by literature, we're bombarded by movies that do not capture this reality. One of the reasons I figured out is just the fact that people basically want to come into literature, they basically want to encounter art, but they want art to be romanticized. Nobody wants to read a book and then be reminded of the fact that they don't have enough money in their bank account. Nobody wants to read a book and be reminded of the fact that they have to go to work every day. People just want to go into this fantasy world of fiction where everything is perfect. And I think that culture is really harmful to reality because it just seems that people are now so removed from reality that everybody is living in denial. I have summed up some points as to why art no longer reflects reality. And one of the points that I made up is the rise of Western culture and individualism. Ethical individualism holds that the primary concern of morality is the individual rather than society as a whole, and that morality primarily concerns individual flourishing rather than one's interactions with the others. So, of course, we can see this phenomenon happening in so many ways, even in our social lives. People are preferring to live very individualistic lives, and this is due to the rise of Western ideals or Western culture. The rise of Western ideals has had a complex influence on the creation of art. In some ways, there's also the argument being made that some people are able to be creative when they are left alone. People, need to tune into their individualism to produce great works of art. So in some ways, it has fostered creativity and self-expression, but in other respects, it has limited the scope of art, especially when it comes to reflecting broader societal realities. Traditional art, especially in non-Western societies, so like in Africa, for instance, a lot of the arts that we have is greatly inspired by folk tales. There is a heavy dependence on oral tradition, and of course we know that the tradition of oral literature is again very infused with communal living, and so it just means that we're moving farther and farther away from propagating these ideals, propagating traditional forms of literature, because individualism is now at its peak. It is also my opinion that the search for escapism is one of the reasons that art no longer reflects reality. The search for escapism has significantly influenced the nature of art, often preventing it from reflecting what is accurately happening. In various forms of media, whether literature, cinema, music, or visual arts, escapism has offered audiences a way to detach from the stresses of daily life and immerse themselves in fantasy, entertainment, or idealized world. There's been a rise in social media gossip, particularly celebrity gossip, where people are so hyperfixated on the lives of celebrities and how they live. I mean, even being on YouTube, as far back as I remember watching tours of houses of celebrities. These days, there's just so many reality TV shows, and that's just because people are constantly searching for escapism. I mean, your life is in shambles. You can barely afford 3 square meals. But of course, if I can watch a TV show about a celebrity and you know how they have excess amount of foods on their table, at least that would make me less hungry. The rise of genres such as fantasy, science fiction, and romantic comedies often provides an escape into imaginary worlds or idealized scenarios. While these genres can offer important commentary on society, such as in dystopian fiction, they often focus on removing the audience from the real world, presenting more palatable, abstract, or distant versions of struggles. In Nigeria specifically, it is the rise of the skit industry. And basically, we know what skits are, comedies are, they make you laugh. They're funny, at least if you can't solve your problems, at least you can laugh about them. It's very easy for you to get internet data. I mean, if you haven't eaten for 3 days, at least you can get 500 naira and buy a data bundle, then enter Twitter or enter whatever social media you choose, and then, laugh your sorrows away. At least you can escape from the monotony of your life. At least you can log into social media and you can scroll through Instagram and see celebrities living their life, and at least you can aspire to live their lives. Chimamanda's half of a yellow sun, the character called Kainene, there is a part where actually this was based off of a movie. When I first saw the movie Half of a Yellow Sun, there was a scene of Kainene that I think it was the first time she was meeting Richard. And in that scene, a photographer was trying to take her picture and she was like, please leave the way. I want people to see my necklace. At least they can aspire them to work harder.
Move out of my place. What? There's a photographer behind who's keen to take a photo of me, and particularly my necklace. The necklace will be featured in tomorrow's Lagos Life. That will be my way of contributing to our newly independent country. We're giving fellow Nigerians something to aspire to, an incentive to work hard.
And so it's just like people avidly consume lives of celebrities, lives of famous people, just because at least they can aspire me to want to work better. But I really think that what it is a search for escapism. So another reason that art no longer reflects reality, and I've sort of touched on this point when I was speaking earlier, but it's also consumerism, capitalism, basically the rise of consumer culture. So as Western individualism merged with the rise of capitalism, art became increasingly commercialized. The artist has now become an independent entrepreneur, selling their work in a competitive marketplace has led to a focus in creating art that appeals to individual tastes, often shaped by consumer demand, rather than art that critically engages with societal realities. This commercial focus can sometimes and oftentimes lead artists to create works that are aesthetic and marketable, but art that is disconnected from social reality. Another reason why art no longer reflects reality is, again, poverty. Because if you fear censorship, and if you fear that censorship is going to prevent you from doing your work, censorship is going to prevent food from being placed on your table, you are going to want to pander to the voices that be, you're going to want to pander to the elitist culture. So if you're desperate, for instance, which is why a lot of people say that for people who make YouTube videos, you shouldn't make videos from a point of desperation. You should just make it because it's something that you enjoy talking about. But that is such a privileged stance to take. Expecting artists and expecting people who produce works of art to reflect reality is actually coming from a place of privilege, if you really think about it, because you do have to come from a place where your belly is full. I mean, your belly has to be full for you to be able to make criticism and to be able to make works of art that are highly critical. So poverty is also another reason why art no longer reflects reality. You basically just want to do things that are trending, The algorithm is pushing videos that are trending, not just even here on YouTube, but also in general life. What is selling is basically according to consumer demands. If the larger populace is searching for things that are escapist in nature, if they are looking for books, that are escapist in nature, books that will stay away from talking about the reality, it just means that you as an artist, as a writer that is hungry or that is starving, is necessarily going to produce literature that panders to the appetite of the general consumer. And so I think that poverty is one of the reasons why art no longer reflects reality. So in case you want to read more about this, or even if there's something that I have mixed up, please let me know in the comment section. But if you do want to read more about this, I'm going to link my articles that I've used for reference, and also for further reading you can just go through them just to have a more in-depth idea about it. Anyway guys, that is it for this video. I hope that you have an amazing day ahead, and I hope I see you in the next one. Bye.